Yeah.
Those who know me know that Spider-Man is my favorite superhero of all time. In fact, he might be my favorite character ever created in all of media. And that's not what this video is about. I'm not going to be explaining why he is my favorite character, but this movie is going to be reviewing the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse film that just came out recently. But before we get into my review on that film, I want to give you guys a brief history on the Spider-Man character, why he is where he is now, why they made Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and things like that. Spider-Man was created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko in 1962. Now, what's interesting about that fact is that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were the ones who originally started Marvel. Stan Lee was the writer. He would come to Jack Kirby with all these crazy ideas, and then Jack Kirby, being the artist, would draw these ideas out. And Jack Kirby had a very specific style of art that is very, very good, but Jack Kirby always drew the characters to be really buff, really strong, really big guys, and that's never what Spider-Man was intended to be. Spider-Man's a teenager. He's a kid. He's not going to be beefed up or real muscly or anything like that, so Stan Lee found another artist by the name of Steve Ditko to draw him. Now, each character is created for a specific reason, and instead of telling you why Spider-Man was created, I'll just let Stan Lee tell you himself.
I was sitting thinking of it, trying to think of an idea, and I saw a fly crawling on a wall. And I thought, gee, wouldn't it be something if we had a hero who could crawl on walls like a fly? So I said, yeah, that's great. Now, then I need a name. So I thought, Fly Man? That didn't sound dramatic enough. Insect Man? No. And I went down a list, and then I got to Spider-Man. And somehow, Spider-Man, it sounded a little scary, it sounded impressive. So I said, I'll call him Spider-Man. I wanted him to be, Spider-Man, to be a teenager, but I'd make him a different kind. He wouldn't be a sidekick. He would be the hero. And again, to make him empathetic with the readers, I figured I would let him be not that good-looking, not that successful with girls. He doesn't have a lot of money. In fact, he doesn't have enough money. He's an orphan who lives with his aunt and uncle. I thought that would make him relatable to a lot of kids.
So Spider-Man was a relatable character to all of the readers, which is why the comic did so well. And it was one of Marvel's best-selling comics for decades upon end. So what Marvel decided to do, instead of making the movie themselves, was license Spider-Man out. They sold the rights of the Spider-Man character to a different company, and that company being Columbia Pictures, aka Sony. Now, why they chose Sony, I'm not entirely sure. I do know that Sony was pumping out a ton of movies in the 90s, and the rights of Spider-Man were sold in 99. And Sony had some relatively good movies come out in that time, like Men in Black and The Fifth Element, which were both released in 97. So that could be why, but I'm not entirely sure. All I do know is that Marvel sold the rights of Spider-Man to Sony in 1999. And it took 3 years for Sony to eventually put out a Spider-Man movie, but they did. And this is entering the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man era. Now, in this era, we get 3 movies, almost 4. But I'm going to talk about that in a minute. The first Spider-Man movie, titled Spider-Man, was released in 2002. And the director/writer was a man by the name of Sam Raimi. And the character of Spider-Man was played by Tobey Maguire. Tobey Maguire played the Peter Parker role very well. He didn't play the Spider-Man role very well, though. The only reason being is that Spider-Man is typically a very quippy character. He makes jokes throughout combat all the time in the comics, and that just wasn't really touched on in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, and it's probably because Tobey Maguire is just kind of a geeky guy. So he portrayed the geek of Peter Parker really well, but not so much the quippy, funny character of Spider-Man. There are a few quips here and there, but just not as much as there are in the comics. But still, the first Spider-Man film, released in 2002, like I said, was very well received by critics and fans alike. And so 2 years later, in 2004, they released Spider-Man 2, which is, to this day, one of, if not the best Spider-Man films of all time. Many fans, many critics agree that there's nothing that beats this movie. That this movie is very, as far as the story goes, it's very tight. There aren't really any plot holes anywhere. The story is very well told and directed. And not only that, but we see a compelling story of Spider-Man and wrestling with good and evil, and should he be Spider-Man or should he just be Peter Parker? Should he get what he wants? Should he get MJ the girl, or should he just do what is right? And it's just this battle inside of him of good and evil, and that is something that we face on a daily basis. So not only was the movie and the story well done and well told, but also it resonated well with a lot of the fans and people who went and watched the movie because it was relatable to them, which is what Spider-Man was created to be after all. And so after the success of that movie, they went on and they made Spider-Man 3. Now, not a whole lot of people like to talk about Spider-Man 3 just because the film isn't that great. And it's not that Sam Raimi did a bad job directing. In fact, I credit him. The problem is that there was far too much that they were trying to tell in the movie. The writers were trying to cram in way too much into this film. So you get Sandman, you get Venom, you get Spider-Man wrestling with the Venom symbiote himself and wearing it. You have Peter Parker wrestling with the loss of Uncle Ben still, and you find out that Sandman is actually the one who killed Uncle Ben, and so there's that conflict, and there's just a lot happening in this movie. And this movie was not well received by fans, especially not well received by the critics. This movie kind of flopped, but they still made money on the film, and so they were able to go and make Spider-Man 4. Now, this movie was never actually made because of directive differences between the directors and the cast members alike. They couldn't figure out the story they wanted to tell. They couldn't figure out the money for the film, the budget. They couldn't figure out all of these different things for Spider-Man 4, so they decided to scrap the idea and forget about it. So we got 3 Spider-Man films in the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man era, but that ended there. In this era, we get a recast. And the reason that there was a recast was because Tobey Maguire's contract was up. After they canceled the 4th Spider-Man film, they canceled all contracts and things like that, so Tobey Maguire was not going to return to the role of Spider-Man unless they signed a different contract, and quite frankly, he just didn't want to. So they got a new director, they got a new cast members, and they started off with a new story. Now, here's the thing where this movie fails. It had been 4 to 5 years after Spider-Man 3 was released, and Sony was about to lose the rights to the Spider-Man character because Marvel sold the rights to Sony, saying, hey, you need to make this amount of movies in this amount of years. So there was a contract there. There was a requirement for Sony to pump out a certain amount of movies, and they just weren't doing it. It had been 4 or 5 years since they pumped out a Spider-Man film, and so Marvel was like, hey, what are you doing? You need to put out a Spider-Man film. So the Amazing Spider-Man film was very rushed, and you can almost tell by the movie itself. The movie is not bad. It's well received by a lot of fans, not so much critics, but it's not Spider-Man 3 bad, but it's not Spider-Man 1 or 2 good either. It's just kind of in the middle. The reason why the movie was not as good as it could have been, because you've got a phenomenal director, you've got an awesome actor who portrays Spider-Man really, really well. People argue that he doesn't portray a good Peter Parker, but he did okay. He did better at Peter Parker than Tobey Maguire did at Spider-Man, in my personal opinion. But so you have Andrew Garfield portraying a really, really good Spider-Man, and people, and the movie just isn't that good. And the reason it's not that good is because they didn't have enough time to write out and work on a great script or story. The story's not bad, it's just kind of average. It's not really that exciting, and the stakes are not raised. But the movie was well received enough that it made money, and they were able to go on and make The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, this is another Spider-Man movie that not a lot of people like to talk about because it flopped. It is the worst reviewed Spider-Man movie of all time. But let me tell you why. Because this movie is actually one of my favorite movies of all time, even though I know that it's trash. The reason why it is a good movie, though, is because of Mark Webb. Now, Sony, I think, was almost intentionally trying to screw up this movie by trying to add in all these little details and all these little things. And what Sony was trying to do through this movie was set up a future of spin-off movies. They were trying to set up the Sinister Six. They were trying to set up Black Cat. They were trying to set up all these characters that you just don't need to tell this one story. But they went on with it anyways. They put in all this stuff uselessly. But Mark Webb, on the other hand, was trying to tell this very compelling, very emotional story of Spider-Man wrestling with being Spider-Man. He doesn't know if he should help out his friend Harry. He's wrestling with this new villain in town. He's wrestling with his relationship with Gwen. And all this stuff is going on in his life, which is true of the Spider-Man character. If you read the comics, there is so much going on. And the conflict of the comic is, how is Spider-Man going to handle all of these conflicts happening at the same time? And so this movie is very true to the comics in that sense, that you see Spider-Man just wrestling with not knowing what to do in a lot of different situations, and the one thing that he always comes back to is Gwen. In fact, there's a line in the movie where he says, "It's always you, Gwen." And there's an even more powerful line where he says, "I can't do this without you." And that scene as a whole, the fight scene itself, is very well done. It's very very extravagant, very exciting, but also the emotion behind the fight scene. Your heart is racing the entire time you're watching it because you know what's coming. You know that Gwen is in danger and that she could potentially die, and then she does. And that scene where Spider-Man shoots his web and it turns into a hand and it's reaching out to Gwen to catch her, that is beautiful. And it was Mark Webb and the editors and everyone else that made that part of the movie so good. I'm kind of rambling on about this movie just because I like it so much. I try to defend it when I can. But here's the bottom line. This movie was not well received by people, even though Mark Webb did as much as he could to make it a good movie. And Andrew Garfield is still a very, very good Spider-Man, in my opinion. But that doesn't matter because this movie lost money and they were not able to make a Spider-Man 3 or any of the spin-off movies that they were trying to plan through this movie. They weren't able to make any of those because they lost money. Now, we get another recast, the third one, which if you think that's a lot, just go back and see how many different Batmans there have been and how many different Supermans there have been. But that's beside the point. Spider-Man was recasted again because what happened here was Marvel bought the rights back from Sony. Not entirely. Marvel does not have all of the rights of Spider-Man back. They can only incorporate Spider-Man into their own films. They partner with Sony to make the solo Spider-Man films, but also Spider-Man can be in like the Avengers and Civil War. So the Tom Holland and Marvel era of Spider-Man is essentially this. Sony, after losing a lot of money with The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Marvel stepped in and said, "Hey, we'll help you out with some money if you allow us to use Spider-Man in our films." Marvel was booming at the time. You had the Avengers, you have Captain America, Iron Man, Thor movies, all doing really, really well. People just eating it up and loving it. And so Sony thought that it was a good move to go ahead and sell part of the rights of Spider-Man back to Marvel. So what ended up happening there was Marvel is now allowed to use Spider-Man in their films, but Sony still has the rights to the character. And they make the solo Spider-Man films, but they're in partnership with Marvel. That's a lot to say. They had to recast again because Andrew Garfield was not under that contract. Andrew Garfield was not under the Marvel and the Sony contract, so they had to get a new actor. And that new actor that they selected was Tom Holland, a much younger actor from Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire especially, but he has done really well. His first appearance was in Captain America Civil War, which came out in 2016. Then he got his solo movie, Spider-Man Homecoming, in 2017, which was very well received by a lot of fans. In fact, I specifically remember a few people tweeting, "Spider-Man is home." That movie was his homecoming. It was all of a sudden Spider-Man is back in his universe. He is the character that he is from the comics, and it's a very iconic thing, a very iconic moment, and people loved it. People loved the Tom Holland Spider-Man film. And as of right now, that is still the case. Tom Holland is still Spider-Man. He was in Avengers Infinity War, which came out this year, and he is going to be in Spider-Man Far From Home, which comes out next year after Avengers Endgame. But Tom Holland has done a fantastic job. He portrays both Peter Parker and Spider-Man really, really well. The directors and the writers of these Spider-Man films and of Civil War and of Infinity War have done a great job with Spider-Man. Spider-Man Homecoming is not as well received of a film as Spider-Man 2 is, but it's still really good and it's up there. And you can't argue that this is probably the most comic accurate representation of the character that there has ever been on film. So now Sony is kind of trying to get Spider-Man back completely. So what they do is they make the Venom movie, which surprisingly, while it wasn't well received by critics, it was very well received by fans and has made a ton of money. In fact, it topped Wonder Woman for overall income. So with the success of Venom and with the success of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Sony might end up getting Spider-Man completely back, and we might see another recast. I really hope that doesn't happen, but it could. It's possible. But here's the deal. Sony, I think, understands who Spider-Man is now. Especially after watching Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, I think that they understand the character far better than they did before. I originally filmed my review on Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse before going and seeing it a second time, but after seeing it a second time, I wanted to give you guys my fresh and more complete thoughts on the film. So first things first, I love the movie. If you are an average moviegoer or a superhero fanatic, you need to go see this movie. It is so good just as a film by itself. The story is solid. It is compelling. The characters are great. They're funny. They are relatable. They are the voice actors, they play the characters so well. Nicolas Cage nailed Spider-Man Noir, and I love it so much. The movie is funny, it's fun, it's rated PG, so you might be like, it's a kid's movie, but anyone of any age could enjoy this film. It is so good. Not to mention the animation is amazing. I love the animation. I can't talk enough about it. The soundtrack is great. Everything about the movie is just so good. I cannot think of anything wrong with it unless I'm being super nitpicky and really judgmental. I mean, and even then, I cannot think of a whole lot that is wrong with this movie. I have a hard time giving it anything less than a 9 out of 10. I think it's a movie that will stick with generations for years to come. But not just because the movie is well made and well directed. And by the way, Brian Michael Bendis had his hands on this, which he's the one who created Miles Morales Spider-Man, and so I think that that's a big part of why the movie was so successful. Brian Michael Bendis is awesome. But the reason why the movie was so great is not just because the story's great, the animation's great, the acting's great, not just because of those things, but also because of the message of the story, of the movie. And there are 3 lines that I think really tell the message really well. One of the lines is Spider-Man of Miles Morales' dimension is saying that every time that he gets knocked down, he always gets back up. And that is something that we know that is true of Spider-Man from the comics and movies alike, that every time he gets knocked down, he gets back up. And it's encouraging for us to do the same. And at one point, all the characters are training Miles, and they keep knocking him down, and they're like, you have to get back up, all this stuff. And it's just a really cool scene. It's really great. The second line is something that Miles Morales says towards the end of the film. He says, anyone could wear the mask. You could wear the mask. I could wear the mask. And that's so true of the Spider-Man character. It's in fact why he was created after all, is to be a relatable character that we could put ourselves in the shoes of Spider-Man. We could wear the mask. We could be Spider-Man. And I just love that Sony knew that about the character, about Stan Lee having made Spider-Man for that purpose, and just incorporating that line into the movie was so cool to me. The other line, if you don't want any spoilers, go ahead and just skip, but the last line, Stan Lee has a cameo in this film. And in his cameo, Spider-Man is going to buy a Spider-Man costume from the store, and Stan Lee is the cashier. And as Spider-Man hands him the suit, he says, "Can I return it if it doesn't fit?" And Stan Lee says, "It always fits, eventually." And I just love that so much. It fits right along with anyone can wear the mask, that line. And it is so compelling. For a Spider-Man fan especially, and knowing Stan Lee, and just that movie really seemed to honor him and the reason why he made Spider-Man, and that's why I love the movie so much. Not just because it is a great movie by itself, but it is a fantastic Spider-Man movie. It's such an empowering statement. That you yourself could be a hero. You yourself could be Spider-Man. It's just, with great power comes great responsibility. That's it. All in all, that is all that I have for you guys today. If you want me to make more videos like this, or you are curious on why Spider-Man is my favorite character other than what I stated here, or if you want to hear me just straight up bash DC, because I can do that all day long, just let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.